as my heir, William now assumes the Scottish titles which have meant so much to me.
At exactly 11:23 p.m. on December 15th, in a room lit only by lamplight and witnessed by just 5 people, King Charles III placed his signature on a document that would fundamentally alter the British monarchy. By the time London woke the next morning, the line of succession, unchanged in its essential structure for nearly 90 years, had been transformed in ways most citizens couldn't yet comprehend. What happened in those late hours? What could possibly force a king who waited 70 years for his crown to sign away portions of his power? And more importantly, what does this mean for the future of the world's most famous royal family? The answers lie not in scandal or political intrigue, but in something far more universal and far more human.
So, Your Royal Highness, if you put the stole over the King's head.
The reality of aging, the limits of the human body, and a father's determination to spare his son the chaos he himself endured. The midnight signing. Picture this. It's approaching midnight in London. December. Cold has settled deep into the city's bones. While millions sleep, unaware that constitutional history is being made, a small group gathers in the blue drawing room at Clarence House, a space King Charles has always preferred for its warmth and intimacy. But there's nothing warm about the atmosphere tonight. The tension is palpable. You could cut it with a knife. 5 witnesses stand in a careful semicircle. Princess Anne, her face a mask of controlled emotion. The Archbishop of Canterbury, understanding he's witnessing something that will echo through centuries. The Lord Chamberlain, guardian of royal protocol, a senior Privy Council representative, and at the center of it all, 2 men, father and son, about to sign something neither truly wanted. Charles takes up his pen first. His reading glasses catch the lamplight. For a moment, just a moment, his hand hovers over the document. What's going through his mind in that instant? Is he thinking of his mother, who worked until she died at 96? Is he remembering the boy who waited his entire life to be king? Is he wondering if this makes him weak? The pen touches paper. Charles R. The signature is firm, decisive, each letter carefully formed with the same hand that has signed thousands of documents, but never one like this, never one that voluntarily constrains his own power, never one that acknowledges his own mortality so explicitly. Now it's Prince William's turn. Later, witnesses would recall that William's hand was steady, but they would also remember the look that passed between father and son before he signed, a look carrying decades of complicated history, of duty and burden, of love and sacrifice. William signs simply, William. Not with the regal flourish he'll use when he becomes king. Because this isn't about assuming the throne. This is about sharing its impossible weight. The scratch of pen on paper, the ticking of a mantle clock that once belonged to Queen Elizabeth, the sound of the Lord Chamberlain's seal breaking into hot wax, louder than it should be, final and irrevocable. By 11:27 p.m., it's done. But what exactly has been done? What could possibly require such secrecy, such ceremony, such evident emotional toll? The medical truth. No one wanted to face. To understand that midnight signature, we need to rewind 3 months, to late September 2025, when something started going wrong. It began with fatigue. Not the kind you shake off with a good night's sleep, but the kind that settles into your bones and refuses to leave. King Charles, a man who had maintained a grueling schedule for decades, who prided himself on his stamina, found himself needing afternoon rests that stretched longer than intended. Engagements that once energized him now left him drained. His physician, Sir Hugh Winthrop, who had served the royal family for over 20 years, noticed the pattern. He requested comprehensive testing, and in early October, he delivered news that would set everything in motion. The results weren't catastrophic, but they were concerning. Charles's heart showed signs of stress. There were early indicators of vascular fatigue. His capacity for sustained high-level decision-making was beginning to show strain under prolonged pressure. Not dementia, not cognitive decline in the traditional sense, but something more subtle, a reduction in stamina that affected his ability to process complex information during long working days. Can you imagine being told this? You've waited your entire life, 70 years, to do a job. You've finally gotten that job at an age when most people are long retired. And now, barely 3 years in, you're being told your time might be more limited than you hoped. Sir Hugh's words were clinical but devastating. Your Majesty, you can continue your duties effectively for some time, potentially years. But we must be realistic about managing your workload and preparing for the possibility that at some point the demands of the role may exceed your capacity to fulfill them without risk to your health. Charles sat in silence for a long time after that conversation, staring out at the Scottish landscape he loved. The question burning in his mind wasn't just about his health, it was constitutional. Here's the problem. British succession law was designed in 1936 after Edward VIII's abdication crisis. It assumes a monarch is either fully capable or completely incapacitated. There's no middle ground, no framework for partial capacity, no provision for a gradual transition. In 1936, people died quickly from conditions that are now managed for years. There was no gray area, but modern medicine has created that gray area, and the law hasn't caught up. If Charles became unable to fulfill his duties, the current system offered only two brutal options: abdicate completely and permanently, with all the public drama that entails, or be formally declared incapacitated, requiring medical assessments, Privy Council intervention, and installation of a regent, all played out in the harsh glare of media scrutiny. Neither option allowed for what Charles's doctors predicted was most likely: a gradual decline where some duties remained manageable, while others became too demanding. There was no legal provision for a king to step back partially, to hand certain functions to his heir while retaining others, to do so quietly, with dignity, without turning the transition into a spectacle. And Charles had watched his mother face similar questions. Queen Elizabeth, determined to serve until death, had gradually reduced her schedule in her final years, but those delegations were informal, based on mutual understanding rather than legal framework. And when she died, the transition was sudden, immediate, managed only through years of advanced planning. Charles didn't want his own transition to depend on either sudden death or public crisis. He wanted something his mother never had: a mechanism that acknowledged reality, that allowed for managed change, that protected both the institution and his son from unnecessary trauma. The conversation no father wants to have. Late October 2025. A walk at Sandringham. Father and son, the autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet, and a conversation that neither wanted but both knew was necessary. Charles spoke carefully. "I am managing now, but Sir Hugh has made clear that my capacity will likely decline gradually, and when it does, we cannot afford to have the constitutional framework decided in a crisis. We must plan now, while we can do so thoughtfully." William's first instinct was denial. "Can you blame him? You're healthy, father. You're managing well. This seems premature." But Charles shook his head, and in that moment, William understood. This wasn't about giving up. This was about love, about sparing his son the chaos he himself had endured during those final years of watching his mother work herself, quite literally, to death. Think about what Charles was asking. Think about the weight of it. He was asking his son to prepare for a burden William had hoped wouldn't arrive for many more years. He was acknowledging his own mortality and fragility, something kings have historically refused to do. He was putting duty above pride, his son's well-being above his own desire to reign until he died. Princess Anne, brought into the discussions in early November, was characteristically blunt. "This is precisely why succession planning exists. You are not abdicating. You are ensuring continuity. There is no shame in that." But Charles did feel shame, even though he tried not to show it. He had waited so long, endured so much, and now he was preparing mechanisms to ease himself out of the very role he'd spent a lifetime training for. It felt like failure, even though intellectually he understood it was wisdom. Through October and into November, Charles authorized his legal advisors to begin drafting something unprecedented, a constitutional mechanism that would allow for managed transition, a way for William to assume royal powers gradually if Charles's health required it, without the drama of abdication or the chaos of sudden incapacity. The document. William didn't want to read December 12th. A royal courier delivers a thick envelope to Kensington Palace, maximum security classification, for William's eyes only. Inside, 2 items: a formal legal document, the draft Transitional Regency Protocol, and a personal letter from his father, handwritten, vulnerable in ways Charles rarely allowed himself to be. "My dearest William," it began, "what follows is difficult to write and will likely be difficult to read, but it is necessary, and I believe you will understand why." Charles wrote with raw honesty about the fatigue, the medical consultations, the growing awareness that his capacity to serve might be limited by time and health in ways he hadn't anticipated. He wrote about fears and frustrations that the king would never express publicly. "I do not know how much time I have to serve effectively," Charles had written. "It may be many years, it may be fewer than I hope, but I cannot in good conscience leave these questions unanswered until crisis forces answers upon us both." William read the letter first, then the legal document. Then he set both down and stared at nothing in particular. His first emotion wasn't preparedness or duty. It was refusal. He didn't want this responsibility. Not now. Not like this. The idea of assuming royal powers while his father still lived, still wore the crown, felt wrong in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Catherine found him an hour later, still sitting in the darkening study. "He wants me to share the crown," William finally said, "while he is still alive, while he can still function." "Is he ill?" "Not acutely, but declining gradually, and he wants to manage the transition while he can still make clear decisions about it." Catherine considered this. "That seems wise." William shook his head. It seems like I'm waiting for him to weaken so I can take his place. Here's where Catherine showed the strength that has made her such a steady partner through everything royal life has thrown at them. "That's not what this is," she said gently. "This is your father trying to protect you from having the transition happen in crisis. He's giving you time to prepare. That's a gift, not a burden." "It feels like both," William admitted. "Can you imagine? Your father is essentially asking you to prepare for his decline, to agree to a system where you'll gradually take over his job while he's still alive to watch, where every time you assume a new duty, it's a reminder that he can no longer handle it." But Catherine was right. Charles had spent 70 years waiting, watching his mother work until she died in office. He knew what that cost her. He knew what it would cost William if he did the same. This wasn't weakness. This was a father loving his son enough to spare him the worst of what he himself had endured. After 2 days of consultation with constitutional experts, after 2 sleepless nights processing the emotional weight of what was being asked, William requested a meeting with his father for December 14th. Why the law had to change. Before we return to that meeting, you need to understand why this was so necessary, why existing law was so dangerously inadequate for the medical realities of the 21st century. The British monarchy's legal framework had remained essentially frozen since 1936. Designed in the shadow of a constitutional crisis, it was meant to prevent another Edward VIII situation, to ensure abdication required parliamentary approval and that succession remained absolutely clear. But 1936 couldn't anticipate the revolution in medical science that would unfold over the next 90 years. In 1936, leaders either functioned fully or they didn't. There was no gray area, no prolonged decline that modern medicine could extend and manage. People died quickly from conditions that are now treated for years. By 2025, that binary assumption was dangerously outdated. Think about the recent past. How many world leaders have we watched struggle with declining capacity while still in office? How many times have we asked, should they still be making these decisions? How many constitutional crises have we narrowly avoided because aging leaders held on too long? The monarchy couldn't afford to wait for such a crisis to expose the gaps in succession law. Here's what made the situation even more complex. Charles wasn't just Britain's king. He's the constitutional monarch of 15 Commonwealth realms: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Jamaica, and 11 others. Each has its own constitutional structure. Any change to succession law had to be coordinated across all of them. Through 2024, Commonwealth realms had begun privately inquiring about exactly these scenarios. What happens if the monarch faces long-term health issues? What if capacity declines gradually rather than disappearing suddenly? The palace's inability to provide clear answers revealed a systemic problem. Princess Anne pushed hardest for immediate action. "We cannot govern based on hope. We cannot assume you will remain fully capable until sudden death. Medical reality doesn't work that way anymore, and our constitutional framework must acknowledge that." The legal team faced extraordinary challenges. They needed to create something that was legally binding across 15 different constitutional systems, clear enough to prevent ambiguity, flexible enough to accommodate different scenarios, and carefully worded so it wouldn't be interpreted as Charles admitting weakness or preparing to abdicate. What they created was revolutionary in its simplicity. First, It didn't require a formal declaration of incapacity. Instead, it allowed the monarch to voluntarily transfer specific constitutional powers to the heir, if medical advice suggested such transfer would better serve the crown's stability. The decision remained entirely with the monarch, but based on medical reality rather than political pressure. Second, the transfer could be partial and gradual. William could assume powers over certain areas, like hosting state visits or conducting investitures, while Charles retained others, like weekly audiences with the Prime Minister or approval of certain state documents. This acknowledged that capacity isn't binary, that someone can be capable in some areas while struggling in others. Third, and most importantly, the mechanism was reversible. If Charles's health stabilized or improved, powers could be returned. This wasn't abdication disguised as health management, it was genuine constitutional flexibility. By early December, the document was ready. The meeting that sealed the decision. December 14th, evening at Clarence House, the same blue drawing room where the signing would eventually take place. Charles' son had cleared 2 hours from his calendar completely. This conversation deserved, required, time and space. William began carefully. "I've read the document and your letter. I understand why you believe this is necessary." He paused. "But I don't want to appear eager for this. I don't want people to think I'm pushing you aside." Charles leaned forward, his expression gentle but serious. "You have never been eager for my position, William. You've carried your role with reluctance and duty in equal measure. No one who knows you could possibly believe you're pushing me aside." "Then what will they believe, Dor?" William asked. "That you're too weak to continue, that the crown is crumbling." "They will believe because we will tell them clearly that we are modernizing how succession functions, that we're planning responsibly for realities that medical science has made newly relevant. There is no shame in that." The conversation continued for over an hour. Charles explained the medical realities. William expressed his fears about assuming power prematurely. And gradually, through the kind of honest conversation fathers and sons rarely manage, they reached understanding. Not agreement yet, but understanding. By the time William left that evening, he hadn't agreed to sign, but he had agreed to consider it seriously. And Charles, reading his son's face, understood that consideration would lead to acceptance. Not because William wanted this, but because he understood, as Charles did, that the crown required it. 2 days later, on the evening of December 15th, William returned to Clarence House with Catherine. He had made his decision, and though it pained him, though it felt like stepping into his father's shadow before his father had fully stepped out of it, he understood that this was what duty required. The ceremony, history will remember. By 10:45 p.m. on December 15th, everything was ready. The blue drawing room had been arranged with careful attention to both formality and intimacy. A mahogany desk, borrowed from the palace archive and historically used for treaty signings, sat at the center. 2 chairs before it. Behind them, space for witnesses. Princess Anne arrived first, punctual as always. A brief kiss on the cheek for Charles, and a searching look that asked without words, "Are you certain?" Charles's slight nod confirmed that he was. The Archbishop of Canterbury arrived next, lending spiritual weight to the constitutional proceeding. The Lord Chamberlain came carrying the official seals. Dame Margaret Whitmore, representing the Privy Council, would ensure constitutional requirements were met precisely. Prince William arrived at 10:58 p.m., accompanied by Catherine. She would wait in an adjacent room, close enough that William knew she was there, but respecting that the signing itself needed to involve only those with formal constitutional roles. Charles and William stood together for a moment, father and son, king and heir, sharing a silence that carried decades of complicated history. Then Charles gestured to the chairs and both men sat. The Archbishop stepped forward. "Let us begin with a moment of prayer." The blessing was brief but profound, a request for wisdom, strength, and divine guidance for both men as they undertook this solemn act. When it concluded, the Lord Chamberlain formally presented the document, reading its title aloud. The Transitional Regency Protocol, establishing revised procedures for the transfer of royal powers in circumstances of the sovereign's partial or progressive incapacity. The language was bureaucratic, deliberately dry, but everyone in that room understood what it meant. This was Charles acknowledging his own mortality and fragility. This was William accepting a burden he had hoped would arrive much later. Charles took up his pen first. He read through the document one final time, his reading glasses reflecting the lamplight. When he finally began to sign, the room held its collective breath. The scratch of pen on paper seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Charles R. The signature was firm, each letter carefully formed. Thousands of previous documents. But this one was different. This one changed the fundamental relationship between a king and his heir. Charles set down his pen and looked at William. The expression that passed between them was complex, carrying apology and hope and sorrow and pragmatism all at once. William understood in that moment that his father wasn't giving up. He was giving William the tools to take over gracefully if that became necessary. It was, in its way, an act of love. William picked up his own pen. His hand, witnesses later recalled, was steady. He read through the passages one more time. Then he signed, William, not with the regal signature he would use as king. This wasn't about assuming the throne. This was about sharing its burden. When both signatures were complete, the Lord Chamberlain applied the official seal, pressing it firmly into the red wax that had been prepared. The sound of the seal breaking the silence seemed to echo through the room. Final, irrevocable. The witnesses signed next: Dame Margaret, the Archbishop, Princess Anne. As Anne signed, she did something witnesses later noted in their accounts. She placed her hand briefly on Charles's shoulder, a gesture so uncharacteristic that it spoke volumes. Charles reached up and covered her hand with his own, a moment of sibling solidarity that acknowledged decades of shared duty and mutual respect. The Archbishop offered a final blessing. May God grant you both strength for the days ahead, wisdom in the exercise of your duties, and peace in the knowledge that you serve a purpose greater than yourselves. At 11:27 p.m., it was done. The morning after. The Buckingham Palace press office released the statement at precisely 7 o'clock a.m. on December 16th, timed to reach British morning broadcasts while accommodating time zones across the Commonwealth. The language was careful, measured, designed to inform without alarming. But within minutes, the statement was being analyzed by constitutional experts across Britain. The initial reaction wasn't alarm, it was curiosity. As journalists and legal scholars began parsing the details, the fuller picture emerged. This wasn't simply administrative housekeeping. This was a fundamental restructuring of how succession could function. The key change centered on transitional regency, allowing voluntary partial transfer of powers based on medical advice rather than political determination. If Charles's doctors advised that certain royal duties were becoming too demanding, William could assume those specific duties without Charles abdicating or being declared fully incapacitated. The public reaction, measured through social media and snap polling throughout the morning, was overwhelmingly positive. 79% of Britons surveyed expressed approval, with many noting that it seemed wise for Charles to plan proactively rather than wait for crisis. Only 11% expressed concern, primarily about whether the changes suggested Charles's health was worse than publicly known. The palace moved quickly to address that concern with a supplementary statement at 10:00 a.m. His Majesty remains in good health and fully capable of fulfilling his duties. This protocol has been enacted as a matter of responsible planning, not in response to immediate medical necessity. Across the Commonwealth, reactions varied but remained generally supportive. Canada praised the King's foresight. Australia's Republican voices used the moment to argue for severing ties with the monarchy entirely. But even there, polling showed majority support. New Zealand's Prime Minister, who had privately requested clarity on exactly these issues months earlier, expressed relief that the protocol now existed. American media coverage was characteristically confused. Several major outlets struggled to explain what regency meant in a monarchical context, with some initially reporting incorrectly that Charles had abdicated. By midday, corrections had been issued and more nuanced analysis had emerged. But here's what most coverage missed, both in Britain and internationally: the deeper significance of what Charles had done. He hadn't simply updated legal procedures, he had confronted the fundamental tension at the heart of modern monarchy: the conflict between the symbolic importance of a lifetime sovereign and the practical reality that human bodies and minds decline in ways that medicine can now extend but not prevent. For centuries, monarchs died in office because they had no choice. Modern medicine had created choice, but constitutional law hadn't caught up. Charles's protocol was an attempt to bridge that gap, to create a mechanism for managed transition that honored both the institution's need for continuity and the individual's need for dignity. What this means for the future. William, briefed on the morning's coverage at Kensington Palace, felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. The public had received the news calmly, which was good, but he also understood that the protocol's existence would now color every future speculation about Charles's health. Catherine spoke the concern aloud. Every time he cancels an engagement now, people will wonder if this is the beginning. William nodded grimly. That's the price of transparency. We've acknowledged that his capacity may decline. Now every sign of that decline will be magnified. But the alternative, Catherine countered, was waiting until crisis forced the transition. This way, at least there's a plan. And that's the crucial point, isn't it? This document doesn't mean Charles is stepping down tomorrow. It doesn't mean his health is failing catastrophically. It means that when the time comes, whether that's next year or 10 years from now, there's a framework in place. No constitutional crisis, no emergency parliamentary sessions, no public spectacle of a king being declared incapacitated. Just a managed, dignified transition based on medical reality rather than legal fiction. Later that morning, William attended a working breakfast with Charles, Anne, and senior constitutional advisors. The atmosphere was businesslike, focused on implementation details and Commonwealth coordination. But beneath the procedural discussions, a new dynamic was evident. Charles and William were no longer simply king and heir. They were now constitutional partners, linked by a document that acknowledged the transfer of power between them was no longer a distant theoretical possibility, but a practical reality that could unfold at any time. Princess Anne, observing the subtle shift in how her brother and nephew interacted, allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. For years, she had pushed for exactly this kind of forward planning. Watching it unfold validated her belief that the monarchy survived not through rigid adherence to tradition, but through thoughtful adaptation. By evening, as the news cycle moved on to other stories, the palace had successfully managed the transition of public understanding. The Transitional Regency Protocol was now part of Britain's constitutional framework, accepted by Parliament, coordinated across the Commonwealth, and broadly supported by the public. The weight of what has changed. That evening, William sat in his study at Kensington Palace, reviewing documents for the following day's engagements. The weight of what had changed settled over him more fully. The crown he would one day wear had moved closer, not through his father's death, but through his father's wisdom in planning for incapacity. It wasn't the inheritance he had imagined, but perhaps, he thought, it was the inheritance modern monarchy required. Not dramatic abdication or sudden succession, but measured transition, planned with care and executed with dignity. Catherine found him there an hour later, staring out at the December darkness. "You're thinking too much," she said gently. William smiled faintly. "Occupational hazard." She moved beside him, their shoulders touching in the comfortable silence of a partnership that had weathered everything royal life had demanded. "Your father gave you time," she said. "Time to prepare, time to grow into what's coming. That's more than most heirs receive." William knew she was right. Charles, who had waited 70 years, had given his son something he himself had never received: a gradual path to the crown rather than a sudden shock. Planning instead of crisis. Partnership instead of abrupt replacement. It was, William realized, perhaps the greatest gift his father could have given him. Not the crown itself, which would come eventually regardless, but the framework to assume it without destroying either himself or the institution in the process. What the midnight signature really means. So let's return to where we started. 11:23 p.m. on December 15th. A pen touching paper, a signature that would alter constitutional history. What really happened that night? On the surface, a legal procedure. The signing of a document updating Regency protocols to accommodate modern medical realities. But beneath the surface, something more profound. A father choosing to spare his son the chaos he himself endured. A king acknowledging that strength sometimes means recognizing your own limitations. A family restructuring how power is transferred, not through death or crisis, but through wisdom and planning. Charles didn't weaken the monarchy that night. He didn't diminish the crown. He adapted it. He acknowledged that the most powerful position in Britain, maybe in the world, symbolically speaking, is still occupied by a human being who ages, who tires, whose body, no matter how well cared for, will eventually decline. And rather than pretend otherwise, rather than cling to outdated notions of monarchs serving until they physically cannot anymore, Charles created a path forward, a way for the institution to survive the inevitable human frailty of those who wear the crown. Think about what we've witnessed here, a constitutional innovation that may define how monarchies function for generations to come, a recognition that modern medicine has created new ethical and practical questions about when leaders should step aside, a framework that other nations, monarchies, and democracies alike may well study as they grapple with similar questions about aging leadership. The document signed at 11:23 p.m. on December 15th altered more than legal procedures. It altered the relationship between father and son, between king and heir, between present and future. And though the public may never fully grasp the emotional weight of that alteration, those who witnessed it, those who signed it, and those who will live with its implications understand. The crown hasn't weakened, it has adapted, and in that adaptation lies its continued survival. But now, I want to hear from you. Do you think Charles made the right decision? Should other monarchies, and perhaps even democratic governments, adopt similar frameworks for aging leaders? How do we balance respect for experience with recognition of human limitations? What would you do in William's position, watching your father plan for his own decline while you prepare to assume his role? And perhaps most importantly, what does this tell us about the future of monarchy in the 21st century? Is this the beginning of a more humane, more realistic approach to succession? Or is it a sign that the institution itself is struggling to adapt to modern realities? Leave your thoughts in the comments. This is a conversation that matters, not just for Britain, not just for the Commonwealth, but for anyone thinking about leadership, aging, and how we manage transitions of power with dignity and grace. The midnight signature on December 15th changed more than succession law. It changed how we think about the very nature of serving in the highest offices and what we owe both to those who serve and to those who will follow them.